I used to read a lot of science fiction as a kid. The majority of it was pulp and rubbish, but it motivated me. It told me that there were things out there to be discovered, and that new planets were waiting to be explored. We'd barely scratched the surface of what was out there, no matter how far we'd gotten. It's what inspired me to pursue a career as a scientist. I wanted to be a part of it as the story's hero. Many of the stories also featured a secondary theme: the belief that there were some things that man was not supposed to interfere with. That, however, never struck a chord with me, so I ignored it. Sure, horrible things happen from time to time, but the hero always wins, right? That is, after all, what makes him the hero. All of this to say, I grew up wanting to be a neuroscientist. We've got robots on Mars and probes in deep space, and James Cameron is diving into the depths of the ocean in his one-man submarine, so it looked like the latest and finest frontier to investigate was inside. And despite all of our research, we still know so little about the brain. We've moved past the days of drilling holes in the skull to relieve headaches, but it occasionally feels like we haven't moved far enough. Synapses fire chemicals along axons to stimulate other neurons, and the process somehow converts chemicals into thoughts. Magic. Demons. Of course, neither of them is correct, but the point is that we don't know. We now know where thoughts are happening, if not why. We can use MRIs and other techniques to observe brain activity in real time. But I wanted to demonstrate that by engaging specific areas of the brain, we might generate specific thoughts. And the way I envisioned doing it was to connect two minds. Telepathy at its most rudimentary, just like in my science fiction novels. Of course, I didn't say it that way in the proposal. I referred to it as an investigation into neuronal activity replication between human prefrontal cortices. That provided me with preliminary funding as well as access to a group of epileptics undergoing the surgical procedure utilizing intracranial electrode grids. Electrodes are implanted directly on the brain, in layman's terms. It produces faster and more precise findings than any other detection approach, with the minor downside of requiring the opening of someone's head to set it up. As I have stated, some days it appears that we haven't progressed much beyond drilling holes to relieve headaches. So, me and another neuroscientist named Ravi put up the experiment. We divided our first two subjects, connected one to the sending end of our machine and the other to the receiving end, and started our testing. Stefan and Greg, our test participants, were each given a pen and a pad of paper with instructions to write down whatever they were thinking, no matter how random it sounded, while I remained in the other room with Greg, the recipient. Ravi prompted Stefan, the sender, with numerous themes. I had no idea what Ravi had put down to avoid unwittingly influencing him in any way. We hoped that when we compared notes later, there would be evident links between the two lists. We both realized there was a significant chance we'd have little in common, so we attempted to keep our expectations in check. Ravi and I retrieved the pads from Stefan and Greg after the first session and sat down together, each eager to see the results. Okay, the first thing I asked him to think about was a meadow, Ravi remarked. Stefan has written, "The big overgrown meadow behind our old house." I burst out laughing. Well, Greg's first thought is, I wonder if the experiment has started yet. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be writing this down, but they said everything. Ravi smiled. And after that, my head shook. He has been playing in the creek with my little sister, looking for crawdads. Ravi shook his head. Both childhood memories, maybe. Let's not interpret, I advised. We'll report what's there, nothing more. Okay, I then requested a ball. A beach ball, multicolored. Stefan wrote, Greg has summer vacation, running down the steps to leave school. What came next was, well, that's a little strange. I begged for happiness, but he gave me a loan in my house at night, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I heard a footstep. But then he says, seeing my daughter after a day at work. So that was probably simply a stray notion. I grinned, delighted. Strange or not, Greg has that feeling when you suddenly realize that someone is standing right behind you, and you jump and your heart races. That's the clearest one yet, in my opinion. And then there's winning a track meet, which is also quite similar. Let's not interpret, Ravi said, but he was also smiling. It appears that the emotion was a much clearer transfer than the physical object. Let me see if we have any more of those. We should just keep going in order, I said, but Ravi was already chuckling as he scanned the list. It appears that Stefan was allowing his mind to wander quite a bit. There are a few things in here that I never asked him to consider. Greeting a friend at the train station, first day of school, and he's just scribbled frustration a few times in between some of them. Greg's got that too, I added. I mean frustration. 4 times in the final quarter of the results. Yeah, 4 times, Ravi affirmed as he examined Stefan's pad. And Greg has picking up a friend at the airport, and first day of school. Their off-script was spot on. At this time, I was comparing the 2 pads side by side. Nothing in your list matches as closely as these extra ones. Ravi smirked. You think they planned this? Unfortunately, yeah, I said. The other stuff, our stuff, is occasionally similar, but these are frequently direct matches. It has to be planned. Why would they do that? He questioned. You don't need this study to become famous if you can reliably answer the question of why people do things. Instead, go publish that paper, I advised Ravi. He smacked one of the notepads into my arm. The following day, we took 2 additional epilepsy patients, Sarah and Miguel. Ravi and I reversed sides this time, with me transmitting with Sarah and him receiving with Miguel. Sarah asked me as I was setting up the equipment, "Can this have any long-term effects?" "Absolutely not," I said. Because Greg said he had strange thoughts all day yesterday and only dreamed of his parents' attic door at night. He claimed he had just dreamed of peering up at it, curious as to what was beyond it. For several hours. "I'm sure that had nothing to do with this test," he replied. But what I was thinking was, if Greg told her this, what else did he tell her? Were she and Miguel playing a joke on us to influence our results? Unfortunately, the answer was yes. Ravi and I both noticed the same kinds of unprompted ideas, as well as the word frustration appearing multiple times on both pads. I couldn't help myself when I saw Sarah penning it for the first time, even though I knew I was just an observer. "What made you write that?" I inquired. She appeared surprised. "You told me to write down anything I thought about." "Right, but how did you come up with that? What were you planning?" "I guess it's just frustration. There was no real event or anything. It was just a strange sensation. Is it possible that I'm just finding the whole thing frustrating? Or maybe just life in general?" She made a motion with her shaven head. "I'm not sure. It was only a fleeting thought." After the test, I told Ravi about it. He made a shaky motion with his head. "I still say they're screwing with us," he went on to remark. "We'll try the next 2 tomorrow, but if they're all talking to each other, we may need to travel to find an uncontaminated group." But we didn't try the next 2 tomorrow. When we arrived the next morning, we were told that Stefan had died while undergoing another surgical procedure the night before. Furthermore, Greg insisted that it was our experiment that had caused it, claiming that it had harmed his brain. Of course, the hospital personnel didn't blame us, but it seemed like a good idea to allow everyone some time to relax. We intended to continue for about a week. Greg was plainly going to decline any follow-ups, but we could work around that. We found out the next day that Greg had experienced a grand mal seizure during the night. Despite being in the hospital, surrounded by experienced medical personnel, necessary medications, and cutting-edge technology, he had not responded to any therapies. Brain scans revealed a complete lack of activity. They hooked him up to feeding tubes and a breathing machine so the family could make the final decision, but the doctors already knew Greg was beyond rescuing. Sarah began to seize as the physicians were doing scans on Greg's brain activity. She, too, was completely unresponsive to any of the treatments tried, and she likewise demonstrated a complete halt of brain activity shortly after the seizure. While the physicians were still struggling to resuscitate her, another alarm went off when Miguel had a seizure of his own. The hospital staff has now blamed us. All three of these patients, 4 if Stefan is included, were doing well in regulating their seizures. Despite our protests that we couldn't possibly be involved, we were the new variable, hence the easy scapegoat. Ravi took a leave of absence from work to deal with the stress. I just locked myself in my office and kept myself busy to keep it out of my head. Ravi allegedly committed suicide yesterday night. According to the hypothesis, he drove his automobile off a cliff out of guilt about our unsuccessful experiment. Of course, it may have been an accident, but no one believes that. The road was clear, the night was peaceful, and there was no sign of anyone else on it. His car drove straight over, never veering or slowing down. That was not by chance. I don't think it was an accident either, though for different reasons than everyone else. Ravi called me 2 days ago. In my house, growing up, there was a door with a padlock on it, he said. I'd always wondered what was behind it. I must have tried 1,000 times to pick the lock. I'd lie on the floor with a torch, trying to see through the fissure beneath. I never opened it, but I was always fascinated by what was going on behind the scenes. I didn't inquire as to why he was telling me this. I knew. When I was a kid, I discovered a little cement pipe in the woods near my house. It was no bigger than my head, far too small to enter. And as far as I could tell, it went back in time indefinitely. I used to imagine it as the portal to another dimension, with monsters oozing out of it, or shrinking myself small enough to fit in and go adventuring on the other side. That pipe signified curiosity more than anything else in my life, and I'd been dreaming about it for the past few nights. There is nothing else. I was just standing there, staring at the hill. Curiosity has taken over me. I don't know what we found, Ravi admitted. What do you think it is? It's curious, I said. I have no idea what we discovered. I'm not sure if it's one item or several. I'm not sure if our machine was just in the wrong spot at the wrong time, or if these things are all over the place. I have no idea, any more than I ever knew what was on the other side of that pipe. I don't think I'll get any responses, but something else is about to pique its interest. To the sound of his groaning hinges and his tired footsteps, the man entered his front door. He locked the door and placed his keys on the kitchen table, the weight of his 9-to-5 responsibilities lifting. His front door entered into a small, narrow kitchen. It narrowed much more into a corridor that led past the cellar door on the right. The area became an ascending staircase at the end of the hallway, right past the cellar. His house wasn't small, but its architecture and use of space were ill-conceived and at least a decade or more older than he was. His lower back hurt from standing for hours on end, and his hands were still filthy from his day job. The sounds from the cellar had returned. He exhaled angrily, annoyed that the reminder couldn't have waited for him to fetch a cola from the fridge and sit for a while. It was relentless, pleading for his attention, and he knew it couldn't wait another night. Despite his other daily responsibilities, he'd have to fix the problem right away. The towering man made his way down the corridor to the cellar door. He came to a halt in front of the mirror he had hung on the right side of the entrance and took a brief glance at himself. He enjoyed having a mirror at the front door so he could check his appearance before leaving, but he despised it at the time for what it revealed. Hooded brown eyes returned his gaze, tired and haunted by age and exhaustion. In the dim light, his face appeared elderly, with dark circles and creases becoming more visible. He had salt and pepper whiskers from not shaving that week, and his graying hair at the temples was becoming long and wild once more. He'd been trimming his hair since he was 22, rather than trying to disguise the male-pattern dullness that had set in so early in his life. Despite his aging looks, he maintained an air of vitality and energy, But tonight he was feeling his years more intensely than ever, and the mirror reflected that. He looked at the tired and worn-looking face that peered back at him for a little longer, mourning for his lost youth. The cellar door moaned in protest, its rickety hinges straining with age. The top 2 steps were no better, moaning with decades of wear and strain as they supported his weight. He sighed once more. They needed to be replaced as soon as possible before they broke beneath his step, particularly the second one. He could drive to the store right now and buy the single piece of timber he needed to remedy the problem. And that would be the end of it. He had the tools, nails, and knowledge to quickly repair it, but his backache intensified, and the constant sounds downstairs demanded his attention. He let out a third tired sigh. He didn't have the energy today to mend both. He walked slowly down, his steps slowed and stiff from the discomfort. When he switched the light switch at the bottom, he was met by the familiar sight of the basement's cement walls and floor. The old support beams at the back of the cellar were musty and cobwebbed, and his tools from the project he had been working on were strewn about. The cool air was dense with the smell of his labors, and the occasional drip of moisture could be heard. He stretched again, arching his back and groaning. He searched for the source of the noise. He needed his wrench. As he sought the table where he last remembered seeing it, the noise increased and decreased. It was time to upgrade. His abilities couldn't keep it operating for much longer. The wrench he needed was beneath the table on the floor. Spending so much time down here fixing things had become tedious and no longer brought him the delight it always did. He walked over to the opposite table, wiping the sweat from his brow. It was going to be another long night. His apron hung on a large nail in the beam above the table, and his work gloves were tucked neatly in the front chest pocket. He wrapped the apron around his waist and over his head. Next, he put on the rubber gloves, which were thick and silky against his skin. He hooked his fingers together and worked the gloves down to the webs. The huge wrench was difficult to grasp in the bulky gloves, but he managed. He held the wrench in his left hand and the wheezing mechanism in his right. He raised the wrench in 2 fast moves and slammed it into his victim's face. The second swing slammed the wrench into the eye socket, collapsing it and putting an end to the constant noise. The wrench smashed his teeth with sickening power, and blood splattered on his apron. The man put the wrench down and took a look at the body. There is so much to do right now. He spotted the utility knife near the body, still within reach, having been used to remove the eyelids the night before. That was quite intriguing. He'd never seen the eye without the skin surrounding it in all the machines he'd brought home to dismantle. It gave the head an odd aspect, making the eyes appear to spring out. That had held his interest for a time. It was finally time. He was finished with this one, and would get fresh parts in a few weeks, or possibly a month or 2, depending on how he felt after some leisure. He'd been thinking about taking a break for a while. For the time being, he needed to disassemble and dispose of this equipment. He considered all of his efforts. As he examined the effects of his deliberate destruction, he noticed broken joints, scorched tissue, and large muscle groups missing significant chunks. The genitals were the first to be exposed. He severed them and tossed them into a pickle jar on the shelf. The scalp followed. He cleaned it and hung it to dry on an old hat rack, eager to add the strawberry blonde mop to the long housecoat constructed of other scalps that he wore when he was alone at home on cold winter days. To make the blood drain a little easier, he made surgical cuts, which he learned from studying autopsy footage. He knew his fumbling attempts couldn't compare to those of a surgeon or coroner, but after all his practice, he felt that he had become somewhat of a skilled amateur for someone utterly uneducated in the medical profession. As the blood collected in the pail at the end of the table, he gathered his scattered instruments. After organizing the space, he grabbed his filleted knife and began removing his preferred strips of flesh from the chest and thighs. He was making good headway on the wall behind him. A few more of these would cover the entire wall. Then he could start working on the other walls. He placed the head on the shelf next to the others, after removing it, and placing it in the preservation jar. He'd need another shelf soon, or he'd have to quit keeping the heads. He was fond of the heads. They reminded him of all the years of hard work he had put in. The intestines followed. He ripped a length free, emptied it, and put it around his neck, swaying and prancing around his workspace while smoking a phony cigarette and swinging the hideous bow back and forth. He chuckled as he removed it and tossed it into the large plastic container with the rest of the organs to be destroyed. He finished up and put the lids on the last of the containers. He placed the chunks of meat he had chosen in the deep freezer and began tidying up the other trash and scraps. It took some time, but the man finally swept up the bone fragments and the last of the solid parts and flung them into the ancient incinerator. After the first batch of solids had been reduced to ash, he'd burn the rest after dinner. He took the connecting hose and walked over to the faucet under the stairs. As he sprayed down his work area, he hummed an ancient sea shanty. He let go of the hose, grabbed the Tupperware containing the liver, and went upstairs. He turned out the light and descended the stairs, relieved to be finished for the night. As he neared the top of the stairs, he was trying to recall if he still had onions and garlic for supper when a loud snap of splintering wood resounded through the basement, and his leg fell into the hole left by the shattered step. He yelped as he fell, taken off guard by the unexpected drop. As fragmented wood sliced into him and corroded nails gouged him deep into his inner thigh, pain raced through his leg and groin. He yelled as he struggled to get up. A huge wood splinter was stuck deep in his groin, just to the left of his genitals. It was more profound than he had imagined. It stabbed into the delicate innards just within his pelvic area. His leg was dripping with blood. It was splashing on the floor under him. He had to cut an artery. Panic ensued. Despite his pain, he attempted to lift himself, desperate to leave and stop the bleeding. The agony was unbearable. Deep incisions on his thigh produced heated bursts of harmful messages to his brain. Was this how he was going to die? Alone and uncomfortably impaled on a splintery, filthy old piece of wood poking out of the stairs. Was this the end result of all of his hard work? His struggle became less intense as his strength dwindled along with his life. He sagged, unable to lift his body off the solid sliver of wood that had pierced him. As the irritating stare jabbed a few more inches from his lifeless weight, he became numb and cold. He blamed himself fiercely in the final seconds of his life, as the blood splashing below swelled to a trickling trickle and the darkness in his vision closed in. He should have simply repaired the dang step. He vanished as the darkness engulfed him. After his neighbors complained about the odor, the cops arrived. They discovered his body on the stairs and would finally make their way down into the basement after removing him. Bins full of bones, organs, and meat would be uncovered, much to the chagrin of the investigating cops, and the nearly covered wall of skin would almost drive them all out of the basement in a mass exodus. Teeth discovered in the incinerator and tattoos on the wall would aid in the identification of individuals whose heads he had not taken and displayed. After the original investigation, 2 senior police sergeants would seek counseling, while one rookie cop simply left the scene after puking and turned in his badge the next day. The officer had only been with the department for around 4 months. Over time, the house became known as the Flesh Pit of Pittsburgh, and it was eventually demolished at the request of the bank that owned the deed to Barnabas Stumper's home. They never attempted to sell it. Barnabas Stumper, on the other hand, would be eternally known as the Beast of Sailors Street, the prolific serial killer who killed over 42 victims in his basement and painted a grotesque mural of their flesh on the chilly cement wall. That was Stumper's well-guarded secret, which he had kept for years, a secret that was only discovered after his untimely demise, which he could have prevented had he simply replaced that fateful step. Reverend and Mrs. Deacon, the doctor will see you right away, the receptionist said. Thank you, Melissa. Tell your mother that the green bean casserole was delicious." "I will, Reverend," the receptionist replied, glancing up from the mess of paperwork that covered her small desk. "Will you be joining us at Bible camp next week?" the Reverend inquired. "I can't wait." The receptionist didn't bother raising her head to respond, instead staying focused on her organizing. For a brief moment, the Reverend stood motionless and silent, trying to decipher the response. Was she serious or sarcastic? He inhaled deeply, preparing to continue the conversation. "Henry, the doctor is waiting," his wife, Marian, clapped, interrupting his inhale. "Please assist me." "Sorry, dear, I know what you were just. We have to leave," Marian announced. Henry turned to face his wife's extended arm. He gently pulled her up towards him, gripping her forearm. Marian placed her free hand on her hip, arching her back and thrusting her huge pregnant belly towards Henry to help support their struggling efforts to lift herself off the lobby chair. It took much longer than either of them would have liked to return to the examination room. The examination room was far too cold to be comfortable. Marian felt the chill bumps on her arms beneath her long sleeves. It didn't seem to bother Henry. Before Marian could settle in, the doctor rapped twice on the open door. "How's my favorite patient and preacher doing today? Do you mind if I come in?" The doctor chuckled as he walked straight through the examination room door, closing it behind him. Dr. McCormick had been the family doctor since they moved to the area 3 years ago. "The twins are moving a lot these days," Marian said, placing her hands on both sides of her massive, protruding belly. Her left hand pulsed as a result of internal movements. Dr. McCormick flipped through the first 3 pages of a blue file folder he had brought with him. "During your last visit, we discussed your blood pressure spike. Aside from that, your blood work and vitals are truly remarkable." "Doc, what's with all the commotion in there?" Henry cleared his throat, with a subtle nod towards Marian. "It's more painful for her than she'll admit. I see her writhing in agony. She's not sleeping. She has yet to find a job that will provide her with any relief. She's only eating to keep the babies from starving." "Marian, you better tell me the preacher here is exaggerating," Dr. McCormick joked sternly. "No, Dr. McCormick, he's not exaggerating. My son never moved like these two. I can't take much more of this." Marian's eyes welled up with tears, and a single blink sent them down her cheeks. Henry gently squeezed Marian's hand. Marian drew her hand away from Henry, her brow furrowed and mouth slightly agape from heavy breathing. Her expression shifted from sadly docile to nearly vicious. Dr. McCormick detected the tension and attempted to diffuse it. "How you feel at this stage of your pregnancy, with the complications you're having, is not surprising. What you are going through is nothing short of miraculous, Marian. It truly is." "It certainly doesn't feel that way. It feels more like a curse," Marian retorted. "I'll bring the nurse in here to do some lab work. I'm going to put you on complete bed rest. Nothing but rest, Marian. Do you hear me, preacher? I know that puts a lot of pressure on you and little Caleb, but it's for the best, for everyone." "Indeed, Doc. That is all I wish for. The best for everyone," Henry confirmed with a nod. Marian wiped her tears away, only to have new tears fall in their place. She couldn't stop crying. "Marian, listen to me," the doctor said, looking Marian in the bloodshot, tear-swollen eyes. "You have so many people praying for you. We'll get through this." Marian felt the twins jerk around, causing her to grimace in pain. Neither the doctor nor Henry seemed to notice. They did notice the nurse enter the examination room. "Henry, you take good care of the missus. Doctor's orders, Marian. You let the preacher cater to your every need," Dr. McCormick instructed, winking at Marian. Marian forced a grin. "Mrs. Deacon, I need to draw some blood. Is that okay?" The nurse was holding a capped syringe and several test tubes, which were all bound together with a blue rubber band. It was the early evening of the 3rd day since the lab work. Henry felt his thigh vibrate and pulled his phone from his front pants pocket. He noticed the caller ID was labeled Doc M. "Good afternoon or evening, doctor. What's the good news?" Henry said this with sincerity. Henry needed to hear some good news. Marianne's inability to sleep for 3 days had already become a real burden for him. "Sorry, not a doctor yet," a female voice responded. "Melissa." It was Melissa, Dr. McCormick's youngest daughter and receptionist. "My father said he needs to see you right away. I'm on my way to your house. I'll be there in 15 minutes to look after Caleb and Marianne while you're gone. He wishes to meet you at the church." "At the church? Why?" "I don't ask questions, Reverend. I just do what I'm told." Henry heard a beep. He took the phone out of his ear to check the screen. The conversation had come to an end. Henry hadn't been to church in a week. He was curious and anxious, but he was relieved that the doctor had requested the meeting at the church. Henry had some tasks to complete around the sanctuary. Henry's gaze was fixed on the floor. His vision was occupied by a daydream about the work he needed to do at the church. The sound of a car door closing jolted Henry out of his trance. He began to scurry around, gathering his keys and jacket. He patted both front pockets of his slacks out of habit, knowing his cell phone and wallet were safe inside. Henry opened the door to greet their visitor. The autumn air was cool and crisp. "Thank you for coming, Melissa. Caleb is at a friend's house. Marianne was sleeping the last time I checked, about 20 minutes ago. If you require anything, please let me know." Melissa interjected, "I'll call." Melissa stepped in front of Henry, forcing him to twist out of her way and onto the front porch. "Oh yeah, Melissa." The door slammed in Henry's face, and he heard the bolt-locked latch. "Never mind," Henry muttered as he walked to his old but dependable car. The church was about 2 miles away. Henry pulled into the empty parking lot next to the church building. Dr. McCormick was standing against the church's front door. "Where's his car?" Henry pondered this as he smiled and waved at the doctor. To reciprocate, the doctor raised his hand. The sun was setting. "Melissa." Marianne screamed as loudly as she could. "Where is Henry?" "I need Henry. Something is wrong with the babies." "Melissa." Melissa nearly sprained her neck as she turned quickly towards Marianne's voice, startled and concerned. "I'm here, Mrs. Deacon. I'm here." Melissa yelled back instinctively as she jumped to her feet and bounded around the couch, heading for Marianne's bedroom. Except for a sliver of light shining through the small gap in the doorway, Marianne's room was dark. Marianne screamed again as soon as she saw a shadow break the solid light shining into the room. "The twins, there's something wrong." Melissa flung open the door, and the influx of light illuminated Marianne. Her pregnant belly was rolling, pulsing, and bulging, stretching her skin to the limits of its elasticity. Marianne's skin was gradually becoming thinner. She gripped and squeezed the bed sheets with both hands by her sides, forcing her head down deep into her pillow, releasing blood-curdling screams and bellowing in agony. Henry didn't recognize the number on his caller ID. Hell. Hearing the quickened, panting breathing drowned out by a scream so loud that it drew Dr. McCormick's attention from 5 feet away, Henry cut off his greeting. "Reverend." Melissa's voice-filled cries. The babies were drowned out by Marianne's fear. "I'm on my way." Dr. McCormick handed Henry a syringe. The tube was nearly full of a thick gray liquid. Henry snatched the tube from the air and dashed for the door. Less than 5 minutes later, Henry threw open his front door, flicking the syringe and squirting a small amount of liquid from the needle's tip as he entered the house. Henry's heart was racing, as were his legs, propelling him towards the bedroom. His forward momentum was abruptly halted in the doorway by shock and fear. Marianne's body was contorted, twisting and turning in unnatural ways, her pregnant belly violently thrashing her from side to side. Henry's panic jolted him towards his wife, and he plunged the loaded syringe deeply into her neck in a single motion. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She couldn't feel anything. As Marianne succumbed to the paralyzing effects of the needle's liquid, Henry saw an imprisoned look of pure terror in her widened eyes. He eased the needle out of her neck, guiding her limp head down onto the sweat-stained pillow. Her stomach settled. Melissa walked into the room. A thin, long black cloth was draped over her arm. Henry lifted the cloth from Melissa's arm and spread it over Marianne's body, completely covering her. Marianne peered into the darkness behind the covering. There was pressure on her lower back. She was being carried. A car door opened, and the smell was familiar. As she drifted off to sleep, the full moon's light caressed her face through the veil. A sharp pain in her arm, followed by tingling in her hands and feet, brought Marianne back to consciousness. Her head was bound, as were her arms and legs, to something she didn't care about. She could see 6 silhouettes through the thin veil, 3 on each side of her. The flickering of dozens of lit candles was visible behind them. The only other light source was the full moon's luminescence, which filled in the shadows left by the candlelight. There were others. She was aware that she was being watched. Marianne convulsed, putting her binds to the test. She strained against the ferocious pain emanating from her bulging stomach. The veil was ripped away without warning, exposing her naked body. The 6 silhouettes were now 6 bodies clad in hooded regalia. Marianne couldn't see anything because of her mounded belly. What she did see chilled her blood with terror. 2 clawed hands were pushing up and out of her insides. Marianne felt a burning sensation in her stomach. Her internal organs were being crushed and torn, causing her excruciating pain. The gag in her mouth muffled her screams as her lower ribs shattered. Her lungs collapsed, and she struggled to breathe. Bile and blood clogged her throat. She was gasping for air. Her stomach was being pushed out even further. Thrashing replaced the pushing. The thrashing became tearing. The tearing erupted in a flood of blood and entrails, flailing in the cavity that was once shared in the uterihome. The exposed beast continued to devour its host's organs, as well as the soft, bloody flesh of its human twin. The beast was born. Henry bowed his head, removing the hood of his ceremonial cloak and placing his hands on the head of Marianne's horribly disfigured corpse. The beast continued to feed, wallowing in its fleshy feast as Henry declared, "Blessed be the mother of our Savior." The room solemnly echoed, "Blessed be." As he spoke the ceremony's conclusion, "So mote it be," Henry's face began to shift into its werewolf form behind a sinister grin. I am a middle-aged man living on the outskirts of Parbold, a little English village. My home is the only one on a long, winding country road, although there is a bus stop nearby. I can see it from my bedroom window on the other side of the road. It's actually quite useful. I never miss the morning bus to work, and I memorize the schedule. That's why I was perplexed when I observed the 3:17 a.m. bus on Saturday, October 14th. It actually woke me up. I don't sleep well. I sat up in my bed, twisted my body, pulled myself up on my knees, and carefully drew the curtains open. And scary, fully gray, unbranded single-decker bus was lighted by an ancient lamppost on my street. There was no lights inside. There was no sign of a driver or passengers. This was plainly strange. Buses do not arrive at that hour in the morning. Ours is not the case in our country. Not in any town or city I'm familiar with. Nonetheless, I assumed, as anyone would, that times were changing. It appeared to be a good concept, perhaps a bus for people who missed the final train home after a night out. That still didn't make sense because my bus stop is rarely used. It's a 10-minute walk from here to wherever you want to go. I double-checked the schedule. Nothing. There was a bus at 11:07 p.m. on Friday, but there shouldn't have been another until 6:05 a.m. on Saturday. As I watched the vehicle pull away, I realized it wasn't a public bus. Perhaps it was a professional coach. That seems to be a plausible answer. I forgot about it and went back to sleep. It did, however, reappear the next morning, and it did so for several weeks. I double-checked the schedule. There is still no mention of a 3:17 a.m. bus. When I contacted the council, they informed me that it was not a public bus. They told I may report any suspicious activities to the local authorities. So I called the cops. They didn't give a damn. They transferred me to an unnamed civil department, which then transferred me to another department. Nobody was worried. Each person I contacted seemed to want me to become tired of the whole situation and quit bothering them. I gave up on seeking aid, but not on my search for an answer. I began taking notes. The bus always arrived around 3:17 a.m. It would persist for around 30 seconds. Nobody ever entered or exited the vehicle. I photographed it and posted it on several online boards. Nobody could figure out where the faceless gray bus came from, but one comment stood out. I recall one user advising me to sell my home and relocate. They stated the bus was waiting for me. Most significantly, they advised me not to board it under any circumstances. That sounded like a no-brainer piece of advice. I had no intention of boarding the shady, unlisted bus in the wee hours of the morning. But everything changed on November 20th. The bus was on time, 3:17 a.m. As it rounded the corner, I knelt on my bed and peered through the curtain. Something wasn't right. It was difficult for me to pinpoint. I heard it after the car came to a complete stop. Someone on the bus was yelling. I became immobile. I had no idea what to do. Silence ensued, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. I was certain I'd heard that scream. I stood there watching the bus. 30 seconds have passed. A long period had gone. It was 3:29 a.m. when I finally took my eyes off the road to check my phone. The bus had remained stationary. The world outside remained strangely silent. I reconnected with reality and began dialing 999. The connection continued dropping, and I noticed that I had no signal. None. At home, I generally had signal. I got up to switch on my bedroom light because I was freaked out. Nothing. I switched the light on and off. There is no power. Throughout the home, the tale was the same. I was going to go to the fuse box when I noticed a blackened world outside my living room window. The lamppost was no longer functional. There has to be a power outage. That was the moment I realized, for the first time in my 10 years of solitude, that I was actually alone. I didn't have any neighbors. There are no pals. There is no family. I was all alone. The enormity of the situation became clear to me. I'd have to get out of the house. My impulse was to stay inside, but I couldn't ignore the disembodied scream that had resonated through the night. I knew it was from the bus. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I ignored it. I confidently stepped into the night, armed with a winter coat and a wind-up torch, shutting my door behind me. I walked down my front walkway, pausing at the gate to shine the torchlight on the other side of the road. It displayed the drab, seemingly abandoned, stopped bus. There were no visible signs of life. Everything was extremely silent. I swear I could hear my heartbeat through my eardrums. I swung the creaky gate open and began to cross the road, seeking vainly to steady my trembling knees. My torch shook in my trembling left hand, so I clutched my wrist with my right. I shone the light into the parked car's windows. There was no driver, but because it was an elevated bus, I couldn't tell if there were any passengers. I strolled around the front of the car, gathering the bravery to get inside. I stopped when I got to the other side of the bus. I attempted to keep my breathing under control. I stared at the doors for what seemed like an age before feeling my entire body clench. The doors swung open. My torchlight was still failing to reveal a motorist. Nobody could be seen or heard. For a brief minute, I remembered that internet stranger who had advised me not to take the bus, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. My instincts informed me that someone was in danger. I walked on board the bus and began climbing the steps. The doors were shut. I climbed the next set of stairs to the elevated passenger platform, holding the torch in front of me as if it were a weapon. I took my time with each step, savoring what I thought might be my last minutes on Earth. Then I lit up the passenger area in front of me. I was half expecting to see nothing. No, there was a passenger on the bus. The young lady was seated in the middle of the back row. Her palms held her head. She was sobbing. I couldn't make out her face. "Are you okay?" I inquired, hesitantly. There was no response. So I started walking forward. I wasn't sure whether anyone else was on board, but I couldn't leave her. I knelt in the aisle once I was only a few yards in front of her. "Are you okay?" I inquired once more. The girl's sobbing stopped immediately, but she didn't take her head from her hands. "You shouldn't have boarded the bus," she said. My torch had died. I frantically wound the side lever, but it didn't come back to life. The girl and I had been thrown into the dark. Then I heard the doors of the bus open. I carefully shifted my gaze to the front of the vehicle. The sound of deep, guttural breathing could be heard. Then there were clunking footsteps. A towering figure at the other end of the aisle was visible in the dim moonlight that poured through the front window. The dark ghost with gangly limbs was approaching us. He slumped forward, his lengthy arms dragging along the tops of the seats. He was both too tall and too wide for the aisle. I turned to face the young lady. She'd taken her head out of her hands. I couldn't even see her. I couldn't hear her. "This is the last stop," she said quietly. "I was hoping you wouldn't board the plane." I wished for more time. I felt a chilly lime snake around my ankle before I could even realize what was going on. I was yanked and fell. My nose made contact with the aisle floor, and I heard something snap. That's all I thought. I assumed that was the end of it, but when I looked up, the evil creature had wrapped its other limb around the girl's neck. It yanked her out of her seat. As she was lifted towards the unidentifiable figure in the aisle, she shouted. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I'll never forget the sound her body made as it was engulfed by the black creature. It sounded like crunching leaves beneath walking boots. At this point, I had nearly completely lost my sense of reality, but some shred of survival instinct remained in my fragmented head. I rolled onto my back and examined my ankle. In the dark, I couldn't see what I was doing. I just knew I had to do something. So I stamped on the creature's limb with my free foot. I stamped as hard as I possibly could. The demon that was consuming the young girl let loose an unearthly howl. It shattered every window on the bus and pierced my eardrums. The limb returned to the dark entity after retracting from my ankle. I took advantage of the situation. I jumped to my feet, spun around, and lunged for the bus's now glassless back window. I clung to the window frame for dear life, taking one final glance at the dark creature rushing towards me. Then I stepped out onto the road. I dashed away from the bus. Adrenaline propelled me forward. I didn't turn around. I simply continued running. I believe it only took me a few minutes to reach the warm and comforting lights of civilization at my current speed. I cried when I noticed that I had service on my phone. I reserved a taxi. I desired the most remote location possible. I went with Manchester and then boarded the earliest train to London. I've been staying in a hotel for the past few weeks. I know I was a little late, but I eventually heeded that online strangers advise. I walked away. I relocated far away. I don't walk outside at night, and I never peek out the window after 3 a.m. I'm running late. I'm running late for a crucial meeting. There's no time to say hello or goodbye. I'm late. I'm late. I'm Alice in Wonderland's White Rabbit. Lot! Exclaimed Brian as he dashed from his third-floor flat. He pressed the down button at least 20 times, hoping that the 23rd time would be the charm. He hurriedly punched the lobby button once he was in the lift. When the lift doors didn't close instantly, like on those science fiction shows, he began violently jabbing the button. As he hopped up and down on the floor, the lift transformed into a trampoline. Finally, after what felt like an age, The doors opened so slowly that they appeared sadistic. Brian burst out onto the sidewalk, which was crowded with the daily march of the white-collared zombies. He then began power walking at the speed of a jog. He preferred to walk to work because buses were too slow and catching cabs in New York City was a gamble. Brian had planned the quickest and most direct route to the Miser building shortly after moving into his luxurious Manhattan apartment. It was where Tyler, Milford, and Drake's prominent firm made their executives rich and happy by making select clients even richer and happier. Brian was acclaimed as one of the East Coast's most skilled efficiency specialists. Walter Schimmel, the director of human resources, hired him on April 11, 1991. He had quickly scaled the business ladder to a position of astounding power, where he handled all of the most important and lucrative clients. Brian remembered every number, person, and location in minute detail. So it was just another day when the possible new client walked into Brian's tastefully decorated office. Brian, who is very detail-oriented, was taken with the man's external appearance. He was dressed in a sharply pressed black suit with creases that might be used to slice salami. His understated but elegant necktie was skillfully tucked into the pristine collar of a beautifully white shirt. His matching black Italian shoes were perfectly polished. His hair was carefully shaped to complement his handsome face, which oozed knowledge, refinement, and confidence. His back was ramrod straight. His stare was intense but not menacing. Brian offered him a chair after introducing himself politely, but the man rejected, stating, "Let's see what happens next before I take a seat." Nealon Murphy, the curious visitor, introduced himself. He just stated that he ran a large organization that has dealt with innumerable clients from different walks of life throughout the years. He went on to say that his company has grown to the point where it needed some creative and efficient reorganization. Brian's well-known reputation for rigorous planning and dispassionate decision-making was mentioned further. But he was most struck by Brian's ability to achieve results with precise punctuality and well-reasoned thoughtfulness. He then issued Brian a challenge. "If you can show me that you can deliver a project on time and at the agreed-upon location, I can assure you that we will be doing business for a very, very long time. Brian, you'll be my man." Although Brian was worried about the man's unwillingness to give any more facts about his company, especially its name, he was enthusiastic about the thought of putting his abilities and reputation on the line to successfully complete a challenge. It would be the stuff of corporate legend, for sure. "Let's hear the challenge," Brian responded enthusiastically. "The rules are simple to understand. It will be practically impossible to cross the finish line. Oh, I think you might be surprised, if not astonished by my unique skill set. All well then. Are you familiar with Manhattan's Lower East Side?" "Know it like the lines on my face," Brian boasted. "Ooh," Murphy cooed. "I'm already impressed with you. Some may regard your statement as arrogant at best, or foolish at worst. We'll just call it moxie from now on." "All right then," the man replied as he studied the two chairs in front of Brian's dark mahogany desk. He sat down after deciding on his favorite. Murphy crossed his legs nonchalantly before pulling and straightening the left cuff of his trousers. He paused for a few minutes before speaking, as if he was deliberately selecting the most cogent and succinct manner to communicate his directives. He cautiously reached inside his jacket's inner pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope the size of an invitation. "Is that invite for me?" Brian made a joke. "Yes, I suppose it is," Murphy responded, laughing slightly. "If you can meet my expectations, that is." "I'm listening," Brian said. "Very good," Murphy exclaimed as he jumped out of his chair and began pacing back and forth a few feet from Brian's desk. "I'd like you to deliver this envelope to me at 104 Beaumont Street at 11:09 a.m. on Tuesday, May 11 of this year. That will be 3 weeks from now. You will fail this assignment if you are not standing directly in front of that building with this critical missive at exactly, and I mean exactly, that instant. If that's the case, I'll have to look for someone more talented and ambitious. And you'll wonder when or if you'll ever get this opportunity again for who knows how many years." Brian tried not to show the huge doubt that had broken off a small crumb of his swagger. As they say on the award shows, "The envelope, please," Brian stated as he leaned forward across his desk to accept the envelope. Despite his dramatic flair, Murphy extended his hand slowly and stiffly, holding the little packet between two nicely manicured fingers. Brian, too, waited for a few seconds with equal dramatic flair before delicately removing it from Murphy's outstretched hand. Murphy then grinned, turned, and began walking towards Brian's huge office's two large hand-carved wooden doors. Brian exclaimed loudly as Murphy walked away, "So, do I give the envelope to someone or just leave it somewhere?" "Neither," Murphy replied. "You open it and read it when you get there, not before. The final and most crucial instruction will be placed on the inside of the card. It's up to you whether you choose to follow it or not. The key thing is that you're where I told you to be when I told you to be there with that item," he added, pointing to the little packet Brian was holding. "Can you recall the terms of our agreement? With this delivery, please be directly in front of the building at 104 Beaumont Street on Tuesday, May 11th, at 11:09 a.m., no sooner, no later." "Got it." Brian beamingly pointed to his brain in the vault. "Outstanding. Oh, and one more thing, and this is entirely up to you. You might want to keep this little test of your knowledge to yourself rather than gloating about it to your colleagues. After all, what would they think of you and your failure to achieve a critical deadline if you fail? Food for thought. Food for thought. Food for thought. I'll see you later. Oh, and just for the record, I hope you succeed. I'm desperate to be impressed. I can't tell you how incredible it would be to have a man with your exceptional qualities on board. Brian, good morning, and best wishes." Brian instantly began mapping out his required departure time, the most efficient and barrier-free route, and his must-meet arrival time after Murphy left. This endeavor would be the pinnacle of everything he had learned from childhood through college, as well as his years as a skilled and accomplished professional. He was more enthusiastic and ecstatic about the job than he had been in a long time. It was the challenge of it all for him. He remembers his father teaching him as a child, "Early is on time is late, and late is, why'd you even bother coming in the first place? Except that old adage isn't applicable this time." He couldn't be too early or too late. He had to be there on time, right down to the nanosecond. What time was it? 11:09 a.m. Not 11:08 or 11:10. It was a precise time in a specific location. He would get up at 5:00 a.m. until the morning of the delivery. He would stand in front of his office building with a stopwatch in hand and walk the route while timing it. Every day, he went through this procedure 3 times before going to work. It took him more than a dozen trials to figure out the exact speed at which he needed to walk in order to arrive at the agreed-upon time. He had some reservations at first. When the big day arrived, he took some time to attempt to relax so that his worry and excitement wouldn't cause him to lose focus or move too quickly. "Ready, set, go," Brian said as he leaped from the bottom step of the structure that held Tyler, Milford, and Drake. He walked in the path he'd memorized in his mind to the point of muscle memory. He walked down sidewalks and alleyways with dedication, drive, and focus. There were only 2 blocks left to go. Continue at this rate. It should take you 47 steps from here to the doorway of the flower shop, Brian's mental coach told him. Men plan, and God laughs, as the saying goes. Brian's misfortune was compounded when, just before reaching the flower store, a couple unexpectedly walked out. Brian was unable to dodge the accident. The man was pushed back slightly, but the woman beside him lost her footing and fell. Brian had come dangerously close to tripping over her. The man began ranting at Brian, but all Brian could think was, "Crap. How did this happen now?" "You idiot," yelled the man. "How long has it been since I hit them? Sue you for everything. Relax and check your stopwatch. Where the heck do you think you're going?" Brian needed to perform some fast calculations. "I know I should step up onto the 14th Street corner curb at 11:07. I'll jog over there and stand on the curb until my stopwatch registers that time," he reasoned. Brian's thinking began to settle down and relax once he was back on track. But his peace of mind vanished as soon as he realized he hadn't put the envelope in his coat pocket before leaving for the office. He was passing landmarks on his route at precisely the appropriate moments, so stopping to look for it would just make matters worse. He decided to keep walking while searching his pockets for the envelope. His thoughts were racing and terrified as he attempted to maintain his steady pace while digging through his coat. Brian was finally able to locate the vexing envelope thanks to Lady Luck's help. In a white-knuckled death grip, he grasped it fiercely. Brian could hear his heartbeat in his ears as he approached the 50-yard-away structure. He hadn't eaten breakfast because he was nervous, and he was now feeling a little sick and lightheaded. His thoughts began to play both friend and foe. 30 yards. What happens if I don't make it? 10 yards. What happens if I do? 6 feet. Take a peek at the time. 3 steps. 11:9. I'm odd it. Brian let out a loud cry. Woo, Brian breathed out. He looked down and realized he still had the envelope, so he began ripping it apart. So, Brian remarked cockily, where am I going, you pompous jerk? Inside the mail came a thick card with the words, congratulations. Now come over here with me to talk about your future. Brian's smile turned into a wide-open mouth of foolish perplexity as the half-ton girder fell directly on top of him. Traffic came to a halt. People yelled and gawked at the pulverized pavement in front of 104 Beaumont, where a man with perfect time and execution had just triumphantly stood. Brian was perplexed and terrified as he unexpectedly appeared beside a lovely gentleman in a nicely tailored black suit across the street. Murphy smiled as he stared at the insane and horrific scene across the street. Wow. I'm blown away. You hit the nail on the head. Some people make fun of the constantly late by claiming they'll be late for their own funerals. But not you, my dear. Sir, you truly are the man. I'm delighted you accepted my request to work for me. I told you we were expanding. But with you assisting with our ongoing expansion, I'm convinced we'll be able to support the many for a very, very long time. Murphy smiled contentedly as he wrapped his arm around Brian's sagging and shaking shoulders. They were gone in an instant. My life was permanently altered 8 months ago. I couldn't tell you what the weather was like that day, what I ate for breakfast, or even what music was playing on the radio when I left the house. In fact, I can't remember anything about that day before I discovered a quiet little arcade downtown that I'd never noticed before. I can't even remember what it was called. I ducked into the place on a whim and took a look around. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical arcade, a moment trapped in time capable of transporting you back to the glory days of gaming. Back in the early 1980s, I spent a lot of time with my father in arcades. It was our single common love, and one of the few safe activities we could genuinely enjoy given my health. Cleidocranial dysplasia is a condition that I have. I'm not going to waste your or my time delving into what that is because you, like me, have access to the internet. Basically, I'm much shorter than everyone I know. My bones are brittle, my spine is twisted, and I've worn dentures since I was a child. I don't mean to upset anyone else with the disease. I'm simply weary of explaining it to people, so I've learned to stick to the highlights. The pinball machines were my major preoccupation at the arcades. Every day after school, I'd spend hours in front of them studying patterns and getting the ideal angle on the ball from the flippers that would strike the tubes I required for the best score possible. When I mastered the machines at one arcade, Dad would take us to another and we'd start over. I was captivated by a combination of the lights, music, and geometry. I'd start playing and then completely zone out until I ran out of quarters or it was time to go home. Even after Dad died, I continued with the hobby, partly to keep close to him in some strange manner, but largely because no matter what changed in my life, pinball machines were constant. They were a source of comfort and zen, which is very unusual these days. It didn't take long for me to locate the pinball machines in the corner. My favorite 4 machines of all time, the ones that had taken me the longest to master as a child and often provided me the greatest comfort, appeared one after the other. There stood the theater of magic, with its seductive sorceress beckoning me in with an outstretched palm. Monster Bash invites me to rock with its diverse crew of musical monsters, the Twilight Zone pulling me into a realm of light and gloom. Finally, Medieval Madness appeared, pleading with me to save an old kingdom. I took a couple quarters from my pocket and went to Theater of Magic. An unplanned date with the first woman I'd ever fantasized about as a child sounded like the ideal way to pass the time. Don't pass judgment on me, guy. It wasn't the succubus from the first Dungeons and Dragons monster manual. At least, I noticed something out of the corner of my left eye that I hadn't noticed before I placed the silver into her slot. A pinball machine I'd never seen before was tucked into a corner, which was strange considering there wasn't one I'd never played. I'd even traveled to other countries on vacation, specifically to play new or unusual machines. The game was known as Madame Marilyn's Occult Pinball. A window on the back glass housed a working small female fortune teller. Mechanical inserts into pinball machines were not new, but they were always entertaining to see. I put my silver into the slot and tossed my extra quarters on the apron, my mind made up. I drew back the plunger, took a deep breath, and let go. The tune Pinball Wizard by The Who played when my ball was launched to the center of the playfield. I was laughing so hard that I wasn't paying attention, and my ball rolled into the toilet. I'd normally be upset about losing the first ball so soon, but this machine had an autosave, so the ball was returned to the plunger instead. I'd punched the change machine a few times and probably went through $20 in quarters before I got the hang of the game. If you've ever played pinball, I won't go into too much detail about how they function. You hit bumpers, knock down drop targets, ride subways and habit trails, and focus on the special task while avoiding drain and gobbling holes. If you've never played one, I'm not sure what you've been doing with your life. This machine has more missions than any other pinball machine I'd ever seen. I was sweating so much from the skill shots that I misaimed more than I'd like to admit. I'd been there from morning till nightfall by the time I reached the machine's wizard level. Of course, not all computers had these, but it was always a wonderful surprise when they did. A wizard level in a pinball machine was similar to a hidden final stage in a regular video game, but a million times harder. Beating any wizard level of a machine puts you in a class of your own. I'd beaten them all, and I'd be damned if I didn't win this one as well. It took me an extra 30 minutes of the most stressful game of my life to conquer it. When it happened, I was in the zone, becoming one with the machine. The music began to glitch and eventually became static. The lights flickered in an enthralling pattern, and the mechanical fortune teller set into the rear glass began to move. Over the static, a sexy voice came through the speakers. "Congratulations, Jerry. You have surpassed me. I will now grant you your heart's desire." To say I was taken aback would be an understatement. You're probably wondering how this machine knows my name. That thought occurred to me as well at the time. I'm old enough to have watched every movie imaginable, which should have warned me right then and there that it was time to get out of Dodge. On the other hand, I've always been an inquisitive person. Finally, I blurted out the first thing that sprang to me. Honestly, it was more of a nervous joke, but how many times could I revisit one of my favorite movie scenes, right? "I want to be big." I probably shouted a little too loudly. It was a line from one of my favorite Tom Hanks movies, and it felt particularly poignant at the time. "Your wish will be granted," said Madame Marilyn solemnly. Madame Marilyn reset itself, and my name appeared at the top of the leaderboard, replacing someone named Arthur. Some youngster, most likely, but I didn't want to focus on it. I went home and passed out, completely unaware of what was going on around me. It was still dark outside when I awoke. My entire body was in excruciating pain. It took me almost 10 minutes just to sit up in bed and put on my lamp. I was confronted with the most horrific image I'd ever seen. My bones seemed to be extending in front of my eyes, grotesquely stretching my skin in all directions. I yelled in agony but didn't move for fear of splitting myself open. As every portion of me was dislocated and transferred to a new place, my joints shifted and popped. This was simply not conceivable outside of a werewolf film. My organs were wandering about inside me, suddenly unbound from their usual placements. Vomit and bile flowed out in sticky ropes rather than ejecting from my mouth. My vision became entirely obscured, and the sutures in my skull began to pulse erratically. When I felt a quadricep muscle shatter like a guitar string that had been wound too tightly, I passed out from pain. I shuddered at the bright fluorescent hospital lights when I awoke again. My nurse said I'd been out for nearly a week. She told me that they had done everything they could to assist me, but there was only so much they could do with the resources they had. I had no idea what she meant at first, thanks to my drugged-up bewilderment, until she brought in a mirror to show me my reflection. My first thought was to chuckle. In the past, I'd seen trick mirrors like this at Halloween retailers, which showed you a hideous creature with your face on it. A brief glance at the nurse's terrified expression jolted the concept from my mind, and I burst into tears. What I saw in the mirror was a messed-up combination between Frankenstein's monster and the person who got converted into the walrus in the movie Tusk. My flesh was stitched and stapled more than a neighborhood craft store. My lower torso was mostly gone, and big chunks of my upper body resembled mangled corpse pieces rather than my own. That happened 8 months ago. I've never told anyone about what happened that day. Until now, everyone assumed it was a botched home invasion. It was a leading police idea that I just went with, since who would honestly believe the truth at this point? What puzzles me is that my fingers were mostly unaffected by every portion I lost or reassembled. They took a little longer, but they were the only objects that didn't have to be rebuilt and reattached or abandoned entirely like the others. Fortunately, I can still play pinball for the most part. My insurance paid for one of those electric lift wheelchairs, which allow me to modify my height as needed. This last month, I've been playing more than normal. I heard there's a large competition a few of towns over at the Corpus Arcade.